I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to Women's Health Unplugged. I think this is going to be a good episode for you. Definitely if you're over 40. I think this is we got to open up this conversation about mental health, menopause. We're going to talk about all the emotions today, but also about how little we're still talking about this. We're also going to talk about loneliness in menopause and how, you really, one of the action items you're going to take away from today's conversation is that you're going to talk about this with your friends. It's not uncommon that by the time a person or woman lands in my office to talk about her menopause, she feels like, even though she's surrounded by other women in her same age cohort, that they're not having this conversation. And I think that we're doing a disservice to each other by not being the person who's, willing to say, this is what's happening with me. So I'm joined today by Dr. Laurie Alpert, who is a naturopathic doctor and a NAM certified practitioner who actually works in my office. So I have the such good fortune of hanging out with Laurie every single week. Welcome to the show, Laurie.
Thanks, Jordan. It's great to be here.
I have so many questions for you. But first, I would love for you to just kind of introduce yourself. And I always get guests to start by sharing what their passion is and how they got to this place in their career to be so focused on this one area of medicine and what it is that's kind of propelling you forward to share this message. I'd love if you could just introduce yourself so that the audience can get to know you.
Sure. Well, I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I was thinking on it. And when I look back at the kinds of things that I was interested in, that I would spend my free time exploring in terms of health, it kind of landed always in three areas. It was women's hormones and the period. And I remember being curious even in my teens, like, why aren't we talking about this more? Why don't we know as much? Why is there so much stigma around it? What's the big secret? And, reading books like The Cultural History of the Menstrual Period and stuff like that, just finding it fascinating. And that, as well as mental health, I've had a track in my career with quite a bit of experience in mental health. Started out with kids and then very quickly realized that we can't really support the kids if we're falling apart, so to speak. So have to support the caregivers, and the caregivers, especially in the last 5 years or so, have really been struggling. And then as well, a personal interest in sleep, just because I love sleep and I am not a great sleeper. And so my practice and my focus and my interest has really kind of come to the intersection of all those. So mental health, hormones, and sleep, and the interplay between all of those at once. And it's just such a common concern or a time of, disruption in all of those areas through perimenopause that it becomes really prevalent in supporting people at this time.
So there's lots of things I want to talk about. I mean, first, maybe you can give some ideas or comments around why you think we're not talking about this, or maybe where you think we are on the evolution of this conversation. It's funny, I was talking to a patient about this last week where she said, I don't know why none of my friends are talking about this. And I was like, It's because we used to slide tampons up our sleeve and then sheepishly go to the bathroom. And if it fell out, we were paralyzed with embarrassment.
Totally.
That's why we're not talking about our perimenopause, right? And so I love your perspective because I know you've presented a ton on mental health and menopause. And what's your general feeling around where the conversation is at right now?
Yeah, it's nowhere near where I'd like it to be. The Menopause Foundation of Canada put out a report last October, 2022. And still over half the people they interviewed think that menopause is taboo, just menopause in general, let alone the mental health or mood element of it. Less than half of people realized that depression and anxiety and mood and irritability can increase at this time of life. People were not talking about it. They reported significant amounts of just loneliness and shame because they didn't understand what they quoted as the mystery of menopause. So I think we don't see, well, you may have a conversation as a kid around puberty and what to expect and the body changes. And we have a lot of conversations now, thankfully, around pregnancy and postpartum and the kinds of things to expect, but we're still really not talking enough about this time of life that half the population is going through. So I just want to see it being more open. And like you said, talk to your friends about it because everyone's going through it.
Yeah, like if you're 51, like like just statistically, 50% of your friends are menopausal and 50% aren't, right? Like you have a lot that you could maybe share with each other. But it's interesting. And I love looking at some of those public health statistics, because when you're immersed in it, like we are every day, sometimes I can forget what is and what isn't normal. And the patient will say, "Oh, I'm sorry, this is TMI, like clots in my period." And I'm like, "Oh God, I thought you were going to say something totally different than that." Like I had
like,
no
oh,
idea what I would have
clots.
considered TMI. And I'm like, "Oh, like I talk about clots all day." But it's nice to get that reflection piece. So if you're feeling like it's taboo or shame, and then you hear us talking about it like so easily, they have to remember,
Mhm.
A, this is what we do all day. And
Mhm.
you are the norm if you are uncomfortable about it, actually. And
Yeah.
we can change it, I think, by having these conversations. But if you're feeling like, I don't even know if I can listen because I'm feeling uncomfortable about it, stay with us and know that you're
Mm.
not alone in feeling that way.
Yeah. And actually, in some of these public health reports, it's up to 75% of people going through menopause saying that it affected their mood negatively. That's that's a lot of people. Yeah.
And I'd love if you could share like what we know right now about the physiology behind it. I know not everything is crystal clear, but
Yeah.
why does that happen? And what do we know at this moment about why menopause changes mood?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think anyone who's ever had a period could probably vouch for, you know, the truth in quotes that hormones can affect our mood. And what we've learned or what we think over time is that it's not necessarily the level of hormones per se. Like we could test your blood work of someone with PMS or someone without PMS, and it would look the same. I know you've talked about this in your podcast. So it's not the absolute level as much as we see that it has to do with a sensitivity to the fluctuations of the hormones. So we know that we are vulnerable at times of significant fluctuations in our hormones for things like depression. So we see it through our teenage years, we see it postpartum in pregnancy, and we see it through menopause. So it's these fluctuations that we think are really impacting our mood. And they've done research into what's going on, what is estrogen's role, and we think it has some impact on the neurotransmitters. And without getting into like the nitty gritty, we just know that this time menopause, like beyond postpartum and teenage years, is probably the time with the most the most significant fluctuations of our hormones. They're the least predictable. They're all over the place. It's not this nice steady decline that maybe we thought at one point it used to be. So it just really puts some people who are more sensitive, but even people who haven't had a history of being sensitive to this, at risk for just it affecting their mood.
And when I think about that, like mood, I'm a big Venn diagram person. I feel
Yeah,
like
I love it.
a lot. I feel like Venn diagrams can explain almost everything.
Absolutely.
I think about the mood Venn diagram, right? Like
Yeah.
there are some big circles at this time of life that are overlapping, are intersecting, are happening at the same time, and are coming together, just whether it's circumstantially during that phase of life, but also just based on those physiological changes. What else is happening? Like, I know we don't want to just think about mental health down to the neurotransmitter. There's a
Yeah,
lot that goes
exactly.
into that.
There's so much. So, I mentioned the fluctuating hormones, but you're right. It's so much bigger than that. And whenever we talk about mood or mental health, we're really looking at it through a biopsychosocial interpersonal lens. So that means we consider the biology. So that's where the hormones might come in, but we also consider the psychology. So our cognitive ideas around menopause and aging. And unfortunately, in our culture, they're still pretty negative. So we have a lot of work to do around that. And we also have to think about the social context. So it's, people feeling maybe judged in their workspace for being older or going through menopause and not feeling safe to talk about it there, or feeling like they're not performing their best at the workspace. And then we have to think of interpersonal relationships and how that can affect us. So you're right, at this time of life, it's so multifaceted. It's not just down to the hormones. And you have someone, maybe you have, someone with a full life, a busy career. They're maybe at the peak of their career, and they go home and they have a sick parent that they're trying to take care of, and they have teenagers who maybe aren't that nice to them, when they come home, and they're still trying to make dinner or do the things, and they already feel terrible because they're not sleeping or they have other things going on. And so those interpersonal relationships can be trying, to say the least. And it's so much bigger than just the hormones. You're right.
Mm-hmm. Made me think just about like even just different cultures and how we've
Mm-hmm.
approached, menstrual health and women's health and how that could impact it. And then made me question, like, are there any cultures that are doing it well? Like, are there any like dominating cultures or groups of people that are real high performers during this time? Because all I can think of is the opposite, right? Where menstruation is still taboo in so many cultures and so many areas of the world that, like you mentioned, women may feel, discriminated against because they're aging or because they're a woman. But is anyone winning at this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I haven't looked across the globe to know. I've had the same question, but I do have some thoughts on it. In that book I picked up when I was younger, The Cultural History of Menstruation, I've often looked back at it and thought, no, you're a cultural history of menstruation. You're not the cultural history of menstruation. It's like, that's one lens. It's the Western European cultural lens. But I did look into Indigenous experiences of menopause in Canada. There was a review in 2018, and it looked at all the research of, menopause in Indigenous communities. Of course, it's only like 22 studies. It's very limited, but they did see, interestingly, that the people who were closer to their traditional cultural values and roots seemed to have a more positive experience around menopause. They would kind of embrace the elder position. They were still useful and in a different way to their culture, caring for grandkids. And there would be a really positive outlook on that. And then some of the Indigenous communities who had been exposed, or subjected to more colonialism and more Western ideas were struggling a lot more, the way we see, other people in Canada struggling. So it wasn't across the board. That's not to romanticize the Indigenous cultures, because there still were some who were having, negative outlooks. But it did bring to mind that question of, there are other ways to look at this and other ways to live, and it doesn't have to be so awful.
It doesn't have to be so awful. So how do we get into like the meat of this conversation? Like how do we help women understand like what to look for in themselves? And then I'd love to talk about like how to like that advocacy side, and what maybe, how do we start to tackle some of those Venn diagrams? So I have these very lofty goals of us solving all things mental health and menopause.
I like it.
But I think, I don't know how to solve the tabooness of the specifically the menopause conversation, but also like the co-conversation with mental health. And so what do you think, like, to that like individual woman who's listening, like how do we help her get into this conversation?
I think it takes courage. I think it takes recognizing that you are worth it, that you have value, and that how you're feeling matters and your voice matters, to bring it up with your caregiver. It is challenging because sometimes people will still bring it up, and there's still such misinformation out there. And so not everyone feels supported once they take the brave step to say something. So it is hard. And I don't have a great answer for how to solve this, but I do think, I wish it was different, but I think that based on the system we still have to advocate quite significantly for ourselves. And I think that's okay to step into and to say, no, actually, I'm really not feeling well. And this is something that I want to pay attention to. I have actually, you could probably share it. I have a download for people to go through to check off to see if some of their symptoms or what they're experiencing might be due to menopause. Like if it's just they're feeling like maybe it's just a little bit of depression or anxiety or significant depression and anxiety, but they don't know if it's related to this time of life. They can do this checklist and they can bring it to their caregiver just to say, look, I have 7 minutes to tell you how I'm feeling, but there's more stuff going on. So even though I'm feeling really unwell and I'm crying, I wouldn't identify as depressed. I hear that a lot from people, that they just are crying more easily, even though they don't say, I feel depressed. They're just like, I'm crying all the time. Like I'm just emotionally, labile, and take it to their doctor. But they don't have time to go through and say, well, actually, also I'm having vaginal dryness and my sleep's disrupted and I'm having some night sweats. I wouldn't call them hot flashes, but they're night sweats. But if you can go in and say, oh, this is happening too, then maybe it's on the doctor's radar. Oh, there's some mental health considerations here, but it's also within the context of menopause. So that changes the conversation. So I kind of lost track of your question, but how do we tackle this taboo? I think we have to just talk about it more. So it starts with talking with your friends, I guess, to gain that confidence, to know you're not alone, right? And to practice it with trusted people so that you can go out and advocate for yourself.
Yeah, you said something at the beginning there that I really liked, like knowing that you are worth it, right? Because I think it's, and as you were saying that, I'm like, and that it's possible to feel better. I think those two things have to go together. Because I think, if we think about our young teenage daughters or our preteen daughters, like if my daughter, was struggling with her mental health, and I'm a huge advocate of mental health support, so maybe I'm not the right example, but let's just say for argument's sake, we've got a preteen daughter who's struggling. We would want to throw every solution at her to help her cope, help her learn self-love, to help her learn how to communicate about her feelings, how to organize her day so that she could manage herself and learn this like level of self-efficacy with respect to her emotions. We might consider medication. We probably would consider therapy. Right. And then we fast forward to her mother or person that is a caregiver that's in menopause. And that person feels like, that some of their experiences are maybe even just traits that are untreatable. Yes. Right. Yes. That like, I'm an anxious person.
Yeah.
I'm a worry wart. This is who I am. I've never been good in social situations, and now I'm worse. I've never been able to deal with conflict. I've always shied away from opportunity. Like you can learn just like that preteen person, compassion and skills, and change your experience of your mood, right? It's not like you pass this like do not pass go and your mood is what like you get what you get.
Yeah, totally. I know. And I think that's why, and a lot of the literature is talking about perimenopause being this window of vulnerability, but it's really a window of opportunity because it's a time where you can, step into your life and finally put the things that matter to you first, including yourself, so I think that's such a good point that we sometimes forget that we're worth it, or we just assume that we're supposed to feel like this, which is way less than good. It's pretty crappy, to be honest, right? For some people, and we just put up with it. And I think that's true for like a lot of things around women's health and hormones, and even the PMS experience. And we normalize significant pain and discomfort around the period when kids are younger. And we know that this is not helpful in the long run for things like endometriosis that get overlooked. So, why are we doing it still in our 50s and saying, oh, I'm just going to be uncomfortable or miserable for this point of time? So yeah, I think you're right. Big advocacy and like step out of, I guess the suffering, and recognize that there are options and there are lots of supports in place that can really, really help change this experience. You nailed
I
it.
wonder too, like about how much the modeling that's come from the gen above
Yeah.
influences like what, people are comfortable with as far as sharing, but also like
Oh
what
my
they feel
gosh.
like
Yeah.
they deserve or what they feel like is supposed to happen. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. But along those lines, I feel like the women, Jordan, you and I think are around the same age. I feel like the women like 10 years older than us who are menopausal or who are going through perimenopause over the last decade have really started to change the conversation. So I feel like we're so lucky that they've gone through it and they've started to blow this up in a really positive way. But I think they're the first, it's the first generation to do it just in the last decade. So you make a really good point. I mean, I have never had a conversation with my mother about menopause. She never brought it. She didn't talk about it with me. It's still very taboo for the older people. And if, even speaking to people who are in their 50s saying, when I went through it and I was really struggling and I would try to talk about it with some of my friends and they would just like shut down, it was just very, not a friendly space to go and people would definitely feel alone. So I think you're right. I think we are dealing with a bunch of those generational stigmas that we're working really hard to undo, and I'm grateful for that big cohort that's a little bit ahead of me that's started this conversation really loudly, but it needs to
Mhm.
get louder.
Yeah, I agree. And I find that often when I'm sitting with those women in my office, I just like admire them big time for what they're
Mm-hmm.
doing and like they're like this relentless pursuit of wanting to feel better and realizing they still have very big lives at
Yeah.
50, right? Then and what that's not like this is just the beginning, like in so many ways in their life. So
Yeah.
I've said that before that I have a lot of gratitude for them being 10 years older than me, that they're paving the way.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And showing
Um,
younger people how it could look, how it could be different.
yeah, that's right. But if you're
Yeah.
not feeling that way, then you certainly we've given you a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like food for thought, right? Like where is that coming from for you? Is there a lack of modeling? Do you feel like women are kind of supposed to be miserable, right? For how terrible that sounds.
Yeah.
There's sometimes when I think about like previous generations or previous, like there was like misery around having to make Christmas dinner and misery around having to clean. And I'm like, part of me goes like that felt like a bit normal, like that's what was supposed to happen when
Mm-hmm.
I think that they maybe could have such more joyful lives than they, perhaps did. Or maybe culturally, right? If this is not something that's ever been able to be an
Yeah.
accessible conversation for you, or maybe if you have a male doctor and no
Yeah.
one's ever kind of helped to try to make the link, right? Like, I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important that if you're on the path and you are in this conversation with us, amazing. But if you're not, I want you to feel like you can come over and that it's safe and that, even if you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to break down some of those walls yourself, that the other side of it is so great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's worth that discomfort to wade through, if it's feeling uncomfortable, it's worth it to get there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What do we know, Laurie, about like some of the other mood experiences that people have during menopause? Like we hear people talking about meno-rage and some
Mm-hmm.
of the irritability quite often. Like, what do we know about those mood states in menopause?
Well, we don't know a lot other than they're very common, but I kind of look at it, you know, we don't know a lot in terms of the like how biology is impacting that or creating that, if you will, if it is a biological impact or not in the way that we think it might, like estrogen fluctuations may be impacting depression. So we don't know in terms of anger and irritability, but I look at it through a historical lens. And I think it's really, really fascinating if you start to zoom back. And forgive me if I'm going down this rabbit hole and feel free to cut it out if it's too much. But I think like the history of how we've interpreted how hormones affect women, right, goes back centuries, like 1800 BC, Egypt, like first concept of what we knew as hysteria, right, was put forth, and it was like this first notion of a sex specific condition, if you will. And over the centuries, like Hippocrates got on board and they thought it had to do with a wandering womb, like your womb was not settled in where it needed to be. And the way to treat that was to get pregnant, right? Obviously, because we're looking at this kind of patriarchal model of what's now modern medicine. And if you look back at it over time, what's really interesting is a lot of the mood symptoms that were kind of shoved under this label of hysteria, which by the way comes from the Greek word hystera, which is the word for uterus. So this hysteria condition was often pathologizing things like anger and irritability, which were traits that if they were displayed by a man were not a problem. But if they were displayed by a woman, it was a problem. It was hysteria. It was a medical condition you needed serious, intervention for. And that diagnosis, thankfully, kind of has fallen out of favor and was only removed from the diagnostic manual in 1980. So quite recently. But it makes me question this challenge that we have as women. We're definitely more angry and more irritable through this time, but it's kind of like, of course we would be. Like, we have unpredictable periods. We don't know when we're going to bleed through our clothes in the middle of giving a presentation while we're sweating buckets out our armpits, And we have, like we said, all those other things going on with we're caring for our parents, or we've got nasty teenagers at home, or we're fighting with our spouse because we are, no longer have a libido because for all kinds of reasons. And so we're feeling less resilient. So things are coming up and it's harder to temper, quote, so to speak, how we're feeling. But because there's such a cultural judgment around irritability and anger, specifically from women, I feel like we really struggle with it. And I get that. I totally get that and respect that. I just kind of look at it through that lens of, how much is this, a physiological problem, and how much is it like maybe we just need to start speaking our mind a little bit more earlier? Like maybe there's things that are coming up in our lives that we're really struggling with, or we're having a problem with, and we wait till the breaking point, or we're less tolerant of it at this age. Maybe we're like, no, I've been putting up with this for 20 years. I'm not going to put up with it anymore. I feel like, I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but again, in October, I heard of this survey from the UK, and they were talking about the highest rates of divorce occurred between the ages, obviously between 40 and 60. And they interviewed, a cohort of women who were divorced between that time. And again, 70% of them said that menopause was partly responsible. Like they attributed menopause to their divorce to some degree. And of course, it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole and say, oh, it could be that like they weren't having sex, so their marriage fell apart, or they were feeling awful, or they gained weight, or all these things, and to kind of put it through this negative lens of why that relationship fell apart. But the flip side of it makes me wonder, well, maybe those relationships dissolved because somebody got to a point in their lives where they said, I'm not going to put up with this shit anymore. And I'm ready to stand up for myself. We don't have that information from that survey, but I think it's important to kind of question where is this anger and irritability coming from beyond the potential impact of hormonal fluctuations. I think that's true at any time.
Yeah, I love that. I had spent some time looking at the historicals around PMS before too. And there was even one, and I can't cite it as beautifully as you just did, but where, for a while we suspected that PMS in part was that this experience that women would have if they didn't get pregnant by their partner, and they had the culture at that time had attributed it so that she was going to drive this partner away because he couldn't impregnate her, and that is why we had PMS, was to drive this person away who couldn't successfully impregnate us that month. And it was such an interesting viewpoint. I'm like, well, maybe we just put the men for oppressing us during that time, right? Probably had nothing to do with the pregnancy part.
I mean, the biggest one, I'll put it in here though, that it's very short, but Freud thought that it was a psychological scar that was a result of trauma from the moment that women realized we didn't have a penis. So when we realized we didn't have a penis, we would go into hysteria.
That was it.
And that was like the driver of our fight. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Freud.
Life is not worth living if I don't have a penis. There's the quote from the episode. But you raised such a brilliant point there. And it's funny because when I'm working with women in their midlife who are embarking on new lives, right? New partners, new jobs, new whatever. And like I have to like circle around to conversations around, and now I'm going on a tangent about STDs and like, you know, re-entering the dating scene and whatnot. They're always surprised how confident I am in having that conversation. And I'm like, no, you don't realize, like, I've had this conversation 5 times today. Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious and interested, and maybe we'll learn more over time, like about these women, about maybe it isn't like, maybe enough is enough, right, at that time in their lives. And I'm very interested in that anger and irritability piece as well, because I agree with you, right? That's, you know, there was that meme floating around just a week ago where it said, you know, what's the difference between being assertive and aggressive? And the you know, cartoon was
your
like,
gender.
oh, your gender.
Yeah.
And it really does raise this interesting point because, you know, sometimes, you know, whether it's like, you know, being around males or men that you're connected to, whether that's professionally or personally, sometimes I wonder, I'm like, if I threw that, like if I had that kind of emotion or that kind of anger or irritability, what would be thought of? And I don't have it, but if I did, like, I don't know how that would be received. And it seems to be very acceptable for those people to behave that way. So I have a lot of curiosity about that, you know, that sort of bullshit tolerance that happens in menopause and what that's about. Is it a consequence of low resiliency because you can't sleep and or is it that we've had it up to here, right?
And maybe it's both. Maybe it's a little bit of everything, right? That's usually the case. It's usually not an either or, but an everything at once. Yeah.
And so how do women start to like think solutions wise about their mental health? I'd love to like leave them with feeling a bit I think we've covered a lot of ground around like some of the theory parts and us wanting to like uncover the conversation, but what do solutions need to look like?
So again, I think it comes down to those pillars like we talked about to support the mood. So supporting the biology, the physiology. So it's, you know, seeking support from someone who you feel supported by. So if you're looking for help and you're feeling dismissed, then, you know, hopefully you have access to someone else, which is not always the case. But, you know, looking for the biological supports, you know, when it comes to medication, obviously antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds can be helpful, but we also see a significant improvement with hormone therapy. And the guidelines, you know, unless it's major depressive disorder, you know, the guidelines actually recommend hormone therapy as helping through this time, and not only helping with mood, but preventing any kind of development of low mood through perimenopause. And it's just in this little window that we see it helpful. So it's not always helpful for post-menopause, but if we get in there early, so kind of looking at the biology and some of the options. And of course, being a naturopathic doctor, there are other options beyond medication to support the biology around mood. But then remembering, like I said, that it's not just that. So we have the multiple pillars. So we look at the cognitive role. So if you're finding that you do feel negatively towards aging, maybe consider what influences, you know, you have around you, and you could potentially actively seek out more positive aging messaging through who you're following on social media or who you're having conversations with about it. And then in terms of, you know, the social piece and changing the context, that's where we can start to influence that by being a little bit more open with our closer circles if we feel confident doing that, so that it becomes a bigger conversation in the wider sphere, you know, and then hopefully it'll become even more open in the workplace. Wouldn't that be amazing if that could be recognized? Yeah. So, and then interpersonal relationships as well. So hopefully you're in a relationship or you have people in your life that you can have some of these more vulnerable conversations with. But if not, then starting with a trusted care provider in a very, you know, a space that you feel is safe would be a nice place to start.
I love that you emphasize that, right? The person that that's caring for you that also is capable of having this conversation, or that you feel like you can go there with them. I would love for those feeling words to just be so accessible for people, to be able to describe
Right.
how they're feeling, right? We talk about that with
Right.
kids often, that those like feeling wheels where we're giving them a bit more language to describe
Yeah.
what's going on inside. And I think, we have this good fortune of being in this like 100% female. We're all between the ages. I can't remember who's the youngest. I think it might be Erin. Oh no, Carissa. So we're all kind of in between like 40 and 50. Yeah, 40 and 50 actually. So it's a team of like 10 women who are all in this age range, and the words that we can use to describe ourselves on a daily basis and how we're coping and how we're managing and what our day, like how it feels and whatnot. That language is very accessible, right? For us,
Very, yeah.
we're immersed in it. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
feeling a bit hormonal today, or a bit luteal, or my anxiety is showing up today for some reason, or
Mm-hmm.
I didn't sleep and I'm feeling really frustrated. And I want that workplace for all women,
Me too. Me too.
right?
I know it's such a gift. It really is. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's like okay to not show up 100%, right? Like I would never
Mm-hmm.
in a million years go like feel like I had to show up and be like, "How are you? Fine. How are you?"
Every day after day, everything's the
Every day
same. Like it's
fine.
just not true. Yeah. I know it would be amazing, and I've had some patients where they've reported like really open and honest conversations with their boss with positive outcomes. And usually that's because their boss is menopausal themselves, or has recently gone through it, or is going through it, so they can recognize and have some compassion. But I think it's a lot harder for people if their boss is not as familiar. And I actually talk about it with my husband too, because he works, with women in this demographic. And I'm like, just remember that beneath the scenes, this could be happening, and they're not going to talk to you about it. Yeah. So,
Um, Thank you so much, Laurie, for sharing like all of I love the way that you put together information and frame it. And it's a very safe conversation, actually, listening to you talk about mental health, which I think is one of your absolute superpowers as a practitioner.
thank you,
I
Jordan.
would love, and you work with so many of our women in menopause with respect to like all their symptoms of menopause. And I think that's also, we didn't even touch on all the other areas of health that are impacted.
Yeah. And even this, we could talk for hours about mood and
Hours.
mental health. There's so much more to say, but yeah.
Yeah, but really like it's starting to like, just pick at that conversation a little bit, and
Yeah.
enough that you start to see it in your own life, maybe see it in your loved ones, maybe giving you some
Mm-hmm.
words that you can use to describe how you're feeling.
Yeah.
Um, thinking about like where did I learn that I'm supposed to be miserable, or that I'm not allowed to feel well, or why would I go to the
Yeah.
ends of the earth to treat my daughter's mood? And yet, for some reason, I feel like my brain can't be changed, right? I think that those are really important
Yeah.
things to kind of walk away from this with. Laurie,
Yeah.
what's your lasting message, or what's your final message for our audience? And how can our listeners get in touch with you?
I think one of the big messages that's important to remember is that you're not alone. Like whatever it is that you're struggling with and you're dealing with, I mean, menopause looks different for every single person. So it is never going to be the same for someone else, but we are all struggling with like similar elements at the same time. So you're certainly not alone. I think a lot of people don't speak up because they feel like it's only happening to them. So that's my big message. You're not alone. And if you are interested in reaching out, please do, just to explore options. That's all that I want for people, is to know that they have options at the end of the day. So I didn't hear the second part of your question. Sorry, Jordan. I'm getting really excited about all this.
That's okay. No, the last part was where can they find you? But
Oh
they can
yeah,
find
of course.
you at my office. And so
Yes,
we will put
exactly.
the links to that, Laurie's contact information in the show notes. And Laurie, you're one of my favorite Instagram follows.
Oh, thanks,
Yeah, you do
Jordan.
such a great job at like just like highlighting, groups of people that don't get their voice shared very often, helping people see themselves in your posts and that, we talk about that often, like people just in menopause not feeling represented online. And so
Yeah.
don't follow the
That's
like
big.
21-year-old Instagram fitness person, like follow Laurie.
That is such a good point of like in terms of even the bodies that you're looking at and the body changes, and that's such a big, we were talking about how we feel and eating and food and nutrition and all that, it changes at this time of life. So yeah, who you're following and the messages they're sending makes a big difference. But that means a lot to me, Jordan, because your Instagram is like rock solid. So
we'll put those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for spending time with me, Laurie. I know this won't be the last time we ever have a podcast conversation because I think there's still more to say, but thank you for spending time with me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.